The floodwaters came so fast that by the time most of Redbird County realized what was happening, entire barns had already been swept off their foundations and carried downstream like children's toys. But while her neighbors watched helplessly as decades of work disappeared beneath churning brown water, Iris Doyle stood on top of a grass-covered earthen mound in the middle of her pasture, listening to 20 head of cattle breathing calmly inside the reinforced shelter beneath her feet, the same structure the entire town had spent 8 months calling an eyesore, a waste of money, and proof that she'd finally lost her mind. 6 months earlier, on a bright May morning when the creek ran clear and shallow, Iris had stood in the Redbird feed and supply explaining her plan to a room full of skeptical ranchers who looked at her like she'd suggested building a spaceship. "I'm putting the livestock shelter underground," she'd said plainly. "Inside a mound. Reinforced concrete, proper drainage, ventilation shafts. High enough that even a 100-year flood won't touch it." The silence lasted maybe 3 seconds before Tom Cavanaugh, who ran the largest cattle operation in the county, laughed out loud. "You're going to bury a barn?" he said, grinning at the others. "Iris, you can't be serious." "Completely serious. That's the craziest thing I've ever heard. Cattle need light, air, space to move. You're talking about sticking them in a cave." Iris kept her voice even. "I'm talking about building a structure that won't float away when the river decides to leave its banks." Tom shook his head, still smiling. "The river hasn't flooded serious in 30 years. You're spending a fortune preparing for something that's never going to happen." But Iris had seen the warning signs others chose to ignore. Rainfall patterns shifting, spring snowmelt arriving heavier and faster each year. The creek rising 6 inches higher than normal after storms that used to barely fill the culverts. And she'd read the updated floodplain maps the county released last winter. Maps showing her property sitting directly in the projected path if the old levees upstream ever failed. So while her neighbors shook their heads and went back to business as usual, Iris hired engineers, ordered materials, and began excavating a massive pit in the center of her pasture. The work took months. First came the concrete foundation, poured thick and reinforced with rebar. Then the walls, curved and angled to distribute pressure. Ventilation shafts tall enough to stay above any realistic water level. A reinforced access ramp sloping down from the surface. Interior space large enough for her entire herd, with feeding stations, water systems, and drainage channels built into the floor. And then, instead of building upward like a normal barn, she built a roof of steel beams and concrete, and buried the entire structure beneath 8 feet of compacted earth, sloped and graded so water would run off instead of pulling. She seeded the mound with native prairie grass until it looked like a natural hill rising from the flat pasture. Strange, yes, but permanent in a way nothing else on her land had ever been. The mockery started immediately. Drivers slowed on the county road to stare. Teenagers posted photos online with captions like "Hobbit Barn" and "Doomsday Cattle Cave." At the diner, people joked that Iris was preparing for nuclear war, alien invasion, the apocalypse itself. Even her sister, Margaret, who lived 2 counties over, called her up and said, "Iris, people are talking. They think you've gone paranoid." "Let them talk," Iris replied. "You spent how much on this thing?" "Enough. And you really think you'll ever need it?" Iris looked out her kitchen window at the mound rising solid and grass-covered under the evening sun. "I think people who plan for disasters are called crazy right up until the disaster happens. Then suddenly everyone wishes they'd done the same thing." Margaret sighed. "You always were stubborn." But stubbornness wasn't the word for it. Iris had simply learned, over 63 years of farming, that the land gave and the land took away, and the people who survived were the ones who respected what it could do. By late September, the rain started. Not unusual at first, autumn storms rolling through, heavy but manageable. Then they didn't stop. Day after day, water fell in sheets, saturating the ground, filling the creek, turning fields into mud. The river upstream swelled against the old levees, which had been built in the 1950s and never properly reinforced. And then, on a gray October morning, the levees broke. Iris was in the barn, her old, above-ground barn, when she heard the distant roar. Not thunder. Something deeper, heavier, like the sound of the earth itself being torn open. She stepped outside and looked toward the river, and her stomach dropped. A wall of brown water, churning with debris, was pouring across the valley floor, swallowing everything in its path. She had maybe 10 minutes. Iris didn't run. Running wasted energy, and energy was the only thing that mattered now. She moved fast and steady across the muddy pasture, shouting commands her cattle already knew by heart because she'd drilled this exact scenario a dozen times over the summer. Commands her neighbors had laughed about when they heard her practicing. "Come on, girls. Move, moo." Her voice cut sharp through the rising wind as the herd turned toward her, ears forward, already sensing the wrongness in the air. They knew the routine. She'd trained them to follow her down the reinforced ramp into the mound, rewarding them with grain, making it familiar, making it safe. Now that training became survival. The first cow, a big Hereford named Ruby, reached the ramp and hesitated only a second before descending into the earth. The others followed in a tight line, hooves clattering on concrete as Iris counted each one. 15, 16, 18. The roar from the river grew louder, closer, a sound like freight trains colliding. She glanced over her shoulder. The floodwater had reached the county road, submerging fence posts, pushing forward in a churning mass of uprooted trees, propane tanks, and the shattered remains of structures that used to be someone's livelihood. A neighbor's red pickup tumbled past, spinning lazily in the current. "Last one," she shouted as the final cow disappeared down the ramp. Iris followed, pulling the heavy steel door shut behind her and spinning the wheel lock until it sealed with a solid clunk. The sound of the flood became muffled, distant, like it belonged to another world. Inside the mound, battery-powered lights glowed along the curved concrete walls. The cattle shifted nervously but didn't panic. The space was larger than it looked from outside, high-ceilinged and open, with enough room for the animals to move without crowding. Ventilation shafts hummed softly, pulling fresh air down from above. Water troughs filled from an internal cistern she'd spent weeks preparing. Hay bales lined one wall, stacked and ready. Iris checked the air quality monitor, the drainage channels, the structural integrity of the door seal. Everything held. Outside, the flood roared past, but inside, the shelter did exactly what she'd built it to do. It ignored the chaos completely. Hours passed. Iris sat on a hay bale, listening to the muffled rush of water overhead, feeling the occasional shudder as debris slammed into the mound and slid off the curved surface. She thought about Tom Cavanaugh's barn, which sat in a low spot near the creek. Thought about the Hendersons' equipment shed, which had been flooded twice in the last decade but never badly enough to make them move it. Thought about all the people who'd laughed at her for seeing this coming. She didn't feel vindicated. She felt tired. By nightfall, the sound of the flood had changed, less roaring, more steady rushing, like the water had settled into a new normal. Iris cracked the door open just enough to peer out. Water surrounded the mound completely, lapping a few feet below the entrance, turning her pasture into a vast, debris-choked lake. In the distance, she could see the rooftops of buildings still above the waterline, but everything else had been swallowed. She sealed the door again and rationed hay for the cattle, speaking to them in the low, steady voice that kept them calm. "We're all right," she murmured. "We're all right." 3 days later, the water finally began to recede. Iris emerged into a landscape transformed beyond recognition. Mud covered everything. Fences had vanished. Her old barn, the one she'd used for equipment storage, had been shoved 200 yards downstream and lay on its side, half collapsed. The county road had been scoured down to gravel in some places, buried under silt in others. But the mound stood untouched, grass still green on its slopes, as if the flood had simply flowed around it and moved on. Iris led the cattle out one by one, and they walked down the ramp into the weak sunlight, blinking and calm. Every single one had survived without injury. She was still checking them over when she heard the sound of an engine struggling through the mud. A county emergency truck pulled up, and 2 men climbed out, staring at the scene in disbelief. "Ma'am," one of them said slowly, "how in the hell are you still standing here?" Iris gestured toward the mound. "I built for it." The man walked closer, studying the structure with something like awe. "We've been pulling people off rooftops for 2 days. Lost count of how many barns got swept away. You're telling me your cattle rode this out underground?" "Every one of them." The second man shook his head. "We heard people talking about this thing. Thought it was a joke. So did everyone else," Iris said quietly. "Within a week, Redbird County looked like a disaster film. FEMA trailers lined the high school parking lot. Insurance adjusters walked through ruined homes, taking photographs. The local news ran a constant loop of helicopter footage showing the scope of the destruction. Barns obliterated, silos toppled, entire herds lost when livestock buildings flooded faster than anyone could react. The county extension office estimated it would take some ranchers years to recover, if they recovered at all. Tom Cavanaugh lost 40% of his herd when his main barn collapsed under the current. The Hendersons' equipment shed, along with 2 tractors and a combine, had been carried a quarter-mile downstream and destroyed completely. Families who'd ranched the same land for generations now faced the possibility of selling out just to cover the losses. And then people started coming to see the mound. At first it was neighbors, muddy and exhausted, standing at the edge of Iris's property and staring at the grass-covered hill rising untouched from the devastation. Then it was county officials, engineers, journalists. Someone posted drone footage online showing the mound surrounded by floodwater, while every other structure for miles had been destroyed or damaged, and the video went viral overnight. A reporter from the Omaha television station showed up with a camera crew and asked Iris to explain how she'd known. "I didn't know," Iris said, standing beside the mound with her cattle grazing peacefully behind her. "I just paid attention to what the land was showing me. Rainfall patterns changing, snowmelt coming heavier, river rising higher every spring. None of that was a secret. People just didn't want to see it. But everyone thought you were overreacting," the reporter pressed. "They thought I was crazy," Iris corrected. "There's a difference. Overreacting means you're responding to something real. Crazy means people think the threat doesn't exist." She paused. The threat existed. They just didn't want to spend the money or effort to prepare for it. The interview aired that night and spread across agricultural forums, emergency management conferences, engineering blogs. Within a month, Iris received calls from universities asking to study the mound's design, from ranchers in flood-prone regions asking for blueprints, from FEMA officials wanting to incorporate her methods into updated building recommendations for rural properties. Tom Cavanaugh showed up on a cold November morning, hat in his hands, looking 20 years older than he had 6 months ago. "I came to apologize," he said simply. Iris nodded toward the porch. They sat in silence for a moment, watching the cattle graze across the recovering pasture. "I lost animals I'd raised from calves," Tom said quietly. "Good stock. Bloodlines I spent a decade building. All gone in 20 minutes because I was too cheap and too stubborn to believe the water could reach that high." He looked at her. "You tried to tell us." "I didn't try very hard," Iris admitted. "I knew nobody would listen. You could have pushed harder. Would it have mattered?" Tom thought about that, then shook his head slowly. "Probably not. People believe what they want to believe until reality forces them to change." Before he left, he asked her one question. "If you were starting over today, knowing what you know now, what would you build?" Iris looked at the mound, solid and permanent against the autumn sky. "Exactly the same thing," she said. "Maybe 2 of them." By spring, the county had changed in small but meaningful ways. 3 families reinforced their livestock buildings with flood-resistant designs. The Planning Commission updated building codes to require elevated foundations in floodplain areas. The Extension Office started offering workshops on disaster-resistant agriculture, and they invited Iris to speak at the first one. She stood in front of 50 ranchers, farmers, and county officials and kept it simple. "The lesson isn't about floods," she said. "It's about respecting what the land can do. Weather patterns change. Rivers move. Systems fail. The people who survive aren't the lucky ones. They're the ones who prepare before everyone else thinks it matters." Someone in the back asked, "How do you convince people to take it seriously before disaster strikes?" Iris smiled faintly. "You don't. You just build what you need to build and hope others figure it out in time." That summer, she added solar panels to the mound's ventilation system and expanded the water cistern. Not because another flood was coming soon, though it might, but because preparedness wasn't a one-time act. It was a way of living, a quiet discipline that didn't need validation from anyone else. On clear evenings, she'd sit on top of the mound and watch the sun set over the pasture, her cattle grazing peacefully below, the creek running gentle and harmless through the valley. The land had given, and the land had taken away, and she'd survived because she'd understood the difference between hoping for the best and preparing for the worst. And when people drove past now and saw the grass-covered hill rising from her property, they didn't laugh anymore. They slowed down, stared a moment longer, and wondered if maybe they should build something similar. Some of them even did. Iris never said "I told you so." She didn't need to. The mound said it for her every single day it stood.